Fear and hatred of Islam and Muslims is manifested by many iterations, and is applied across the world in various expressions and actions. Such variety and resentment of Islam could be about how the expansion of immigration, and namely that of Muslim people, into Western societies, let's call it the invasive kind, that triggers an us and them status. Whereas another variation of hatred of Islam comes from sectarianism or religious persecution, both of which can be seen in Hindu on Muslim violence in India or in the Uyghur genocides in China. These acts of physical violence against Muslims are typically infused with political foundations. The third and final kind, and the topic of this video, is the threat of the ideological kind, a threat that is supposedly confronting the Western world, how Islam presents a comprehensive system for society that is continuously being pushed as contrary and antagonistic to the evolving beliefs and ideas that characterize Western ideals and their subsequent way of life. This third kind of hatred and fear for Islam is a Western construct, now commonly labeled and referred to as Islamophobia, a term used by the West in its media, its educational institutions, and across its societal discourses. The first uses of the word Islamophobia, or in its original version, Islamophobie, appeared in a book by the scholars Etienne Dinet and Sliman bin Ibrahim, The Orient Seen from the Occident, in 1918. In a subsequent book by the same authors published in 1930, The Pilgrimage to the Sacred House of Allah, Dinet would attempt a clear definition of the term Islamophobia as the persistence of Europe's more or less disguised hostility against Islam. More contemporary definitions of this word offer this explanation. Islamophobia is a fear, prejudice, and hatred of Muslims that leads to provocation, hostility, and intolerance by means of threatening, harassment, abuse, incitement, and intimidation of Muslims and non-Muslims, both in the online and offline world. But Islamophobia as a word, although a 20th century invention, in its essence of Islam's misunderstanding, fear, and hatred, has since the very beginning of the faith been a repeated practice as early as the establishment of the caliphates in the 7th century. Many defeats and land conquests for the Christian empires or kingdoms of the time came at the hands of Islam. Since then, the Crusades took place, and an epic fight between the Christian and Muslim faith would only multiply the fanatical ill will and chasm from Christianity's perspective. Thus began a Western narrative that twisted the facts of Islam, referring to its followers as Muhammadan or Mohammedans or even Saracens, terms that misrepresented the faith as heretical, primitive, and savage. Several centuries later, and the Ottoman Empire would represent a global power equal to that of the great European empires of Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, an empire that was at the doorsteps of Europe yet was considered by the Europeans as beneath them in stature, characterized by barbarity, oppression, and inferior intelligence. So yes, the term itself may be just over 100 years old, but its true function has been in place since the establishment of the faith, to represent the fear, hatred, and hostility towards a substituted Islam. In today's discourses, the word Islamophobia is used without care and without a clear understanding of its true definition, regardless of the credentials of those who use it. And it's this word Islamophobia that I have a major problem with, and for two main reasons. The first is the definition of what the prefix Islam signifies. Does it truly represent Islam and the Muslim people? The second issue I have is the inferences that are inherent in the word Islamophobia. It's as if the person who suffers from such a condition is excused by something that at some point in time was either misunderstood or imposed upon him or her, and hence not really guilty of much wrongdoing. On the contrary, they struggle not through any fault of theirs, but because it is something out of their control and possibly due to the possible correctness and applicability of such a fear. Expanding on the first issue I have, and that's identifying what version of Islam serves the definition of Islamophobia, one must also ask in parallel, whose version is it? Is the Islam in Islamophobia the definition as laid out by Muslims themselves, and how they exist as a people, day in, day out? How their lives revolve around their faith and the practice of the Muslim faith, or when life happens outside it? Or is the version of Islam and Islamophobia the version developed over many centuries of Western misunderstanding, fear, and hate of Islam? The caution and wariness of an invasive, uncivil, and aggressive body of humans out to get the West and their sets of values, morals, and ethics, akin to the theory of the Great Replacement. Does Islamophobia speak of a fear of these people or of these people? Unfortunately, it's this latter version that is prevalent. The version that there is some underlying justification to fear and hate Islam. And this state of being leads us to the expansion of the second issue I have, and for my disliking of the term Islamophobia. You see, once there is justification on a subconscious level of the fear and hate, then when one uses or hears the words Islamophobia, it has the contrary impact. It's no longer about criticizing or holding accountable the person with such a mental disorder, but in fact, it's about prejudicially reminding the world of the presumed terrors that Islam has been propagating. Strangely enough, in this real expression of Islamophobia, one seems to be left with less aversion towards the Islamophobe, but much more for the faith and believers of Islam. Now, this all takes us back to the kind of threat that this Islamophobia presents, the ideological variation. Yes, it's all about ideas and beliefs, those of the West against those of Islam. Not necessarily in the content of those Islamic ideas or beliefs, but in how absolute they are. The West's main issue with Islam is its absolutism, in its cut-and-dry approach to many elements of life, and the West fears all things that are absolute. They admire their relativity, that all things are up for negotiation and up for sale, regardless of truth, morality, ethics, and justice. And Islam has been an obstacle for this relativism, for this notion that with modernity one must do away with all universal values, completely abandon them. And in return, the West has lambasted Islam, even to the extent that when it labels the mental disorder as Islamophobia, intrinsic within its conditioning and use of the word, it criticizes the faith. And we've seen this for so many decades, in education with how the West creates a chasm between Islam and the other Abrahamic faiths, by focusing on the minor differences even though much more aligns them. How in school books the mention of Islam is exclusively associated textually and visually with elements of violence and extremism. Beyond education, we see the phenomenon in the various Western media, where we regularly see how the mention of Islamophobia triggers the immediate fear of a very small and limited iteration of Muslim existence, one of backwardness, and one where the constant threat is of an invasion of the Western way of life, supportive and predisposed to violence and terrorism, or sympathetic towards them. And with all this concentrated focus on the fictitious backwardness, aggression, and inhumanity of Islam, where are the real believers and representatives of this faith in the narratives and discourses of Western education and media? Where are they in how Islam is represented and in how they are theoretically fearsome? Where is Islam's human population and humanity in all of this? Many years ago, I was misrepresented in the same way. During my high school years, traveling in Austria for a soccer tournament on a tram in downtown Vienna was when I experienced what I believe to be my first case of being an Islamophobia victim. It was I and 3 friends, 2 Egyptians and an Ethiopian, standing and chatting out loud when I caught the stare of an elderly Austrian lady. It wasn't a kind stare. It was full of despise and anger. Now, it could have been that she was purely racially profiling us as non-white, and hence she feared and loathed us. But that's exactly the point. That's how the West's depictions of Islam and Islamophobia operates, without highlighting the religion's ethnic and racial vastness, that then results in a blanket hate for all. How a very small sliver of bad Muslims, the extremists, are reflective of an entire faith and its believer base. That is the true crime and missed opportunity of the word Islamophobia in light of its abundant use by the West. A word that should ideally designate a fear, hostility, and hatred towards all Muslims in their entirety, and how they are as day-to-day people living amongst the global population. It would be much more powerful and would represent a real stigma on those who show it, where it's virtually a hate on humanity in its entirety. But that will only happen if and when a true understanding of Islam and its correct meaning is achieved. Not a Western one, but a universal one.